Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast,
where we explore natural, homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 77, and today I'm here with Dr. Cassidy Freitas talking about boundaries. Cassidy is a mom to 3, California-based licensed marriage and family therapist in private practice, and host of Holding Space podcast. She's a friend of mine, she's a friend of the show, and the perfect boundaries connoisseur to share this surprisingly juicy conversation with. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. One of the things we often work through in the Sage Family Village. So if you find yourself craving more personalized guidance after listening to this episode and hearing us flip everything you thought you knew about boundaries upside down, join us in the village and do this work in community at sagefamily.com/village. My friend, brilliant therapist, and creative entrepreneur Cassidy joined us in episode 3 to talk about therapy, episode 59 to talk about social media, and she is back today for a conversation on a topic that has been burning a hole in my brain, as it is the number one issue of challenge I see coming up in my community right now: boundaries. So I'm probably going to talk a lot today. Consider yourself warned. Cassidy not only knows her stuff professionally, but practices her values well personally. So I am downright giddy to have this chat today. Welcome back to the show, my friend.
Rachel, thank you so much for having me back. It feels like such an honor to be invited on again. You and I have joked about this. Like, I would come on and talk to you about rocks. If you want to have an hour-long conversation about the power of rocks and the metaphors of rocks or whatever, I would talk about it with you. So when you asked, I said, yep, I'll make it work. And I am so excited to hear your thoughts around boundaries. And so, yeah, for the listener, this isn't just going to be the Dr. Cassidy show, boundary show. This is I want to learn from you, Rachel. We're going to learn from each other. And I'm so excited to chat about this topic.
Oh my God. First, I love you. Let's just so the world knows that. Second, do you want to remind everyone? I mean, you are our first 3-timer, so I'm sure my audience knows you, but just in case someone saw the title Boundaries and they're like, oh, I've got to listen. Do you want to remind everyone just who you are and what you're passionate about?
Yes. So I'm Dr. Cassidy Freitas. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I work in the state of California. I'm based in San Diego, which is where you and I first met many, many years ago. I'm a mother of 3, a 10-year-old, 7-year-old, and an almost 2-year-old. And you and I first met after my first, and I was like, what the heck? I was a therapist and, I knew things, but I was so not prepared, and it just really rocked me. And I felt disconnected from myself, disconnected from my partner, disconnected from my new baby. And I was like, oh my gosh, what kind of mother am I? I've wanted to be a mother my whole life. And now I feel like I don't know what I'm doing, and just so much shame. And I was like, okay, I need to meet other moms. I need to go do things with my baby. And I stumbled upon your baby massage class, went into your home, took off my shoes, sat on your carpet, and just fell in love with you from the very beginning, because not only were you teaching us baby massage, but you were talking to us in the middle of our little massaging techniques about different things related to motherhood. And I've shared this in other conversations that you and I have recorded and shared with others, like on my podcast. But what I found myself doing was actually mimicking how you would look at your baby doll as you were massaging this doll. And
Oh.
I would look at my daughter in those ways and use kind of your voice. And slowly but surely it became my own. And our relationship was a slow burn. And now it's like, it's one of the most meaningful, connecting relationships of my lifetime. And it's, some, I think the greatest love stories take time, and mine did. And you were a big part of supporting me in building that connection from the beginning. And so you've just been such a person in my life from the beginning of my identity and season of motherhood. And so it's just so cool to be connected to you now in these other ways. And yeah, beyond being a mother and a therapist, I'm also a partner. My husband and I have been married for many years. We've been together since high school. I also have a side business where I support therapists in building modern private practices. I have a podcast called Holding Space. That one's geared towards parents, and then another podcast called Holding Space for Therapists, where it's really more focused on supporting all the things that therapists and coaches sort of navigate professionally and personally.
Now I'm all mushy inside.
I love that. I love the mushy.
Seriously, the more you guys can spend virtual time in Cassidy's sphere of influence, the better off you'll be. So definitely listen to her podcast. I have taken her course for therapists and it was awesome. But okay, let's get into boundaries here, and let's start at the very beginning.
The very best place to start.
Julie Andrews is going to help us today. What are boundaries?
You want me to take this one?
Yes.
Or I can
because
start
I've
us
heard
off.
you define this, and I love your definition too.
Well, my definition that I love is not my own. And so it's from Prentice Hemphill. And the definition here, and I'm not going to say it verbatim because I'm inspired by, but also, making it sort of my own understanding and relating to it in my own way. But I see boundaries as the space between me and you or someone or something in which I can still care for this thing in a way that feels right, or still love this thing or this person while still caring for and loving myself. And this space, this distance, I'm a super visual person. So I even kind of like want to put something in this space, right? Like how not only is there maybe distance in the space, but is it, how firm is that space? How porous is that space, right? How rigid is that space? That distance, that space between me and you or someone or something like the news or social media, right? That distance, I've got to gauge, and I've got to listen to my body and the signals that my body and my mind are sending me that help me indicate how much space do I need there for me to care for this thing, like to care for the news or to care for to have a place in my heart for my mother-in-law, right? Like while still caring for and loving myself. We can even put our children there, right? Like, what does that space look like? And there are different seasons in our life where how porous this is, or how distant something is, or how close we are in terms of that boundary, that space between us. There's seasons in our life where that can shift. So, for instance, after I had my first child, you know, some of the boundaries that I had with certain family members it shifted. At no other season in my life would my mother-in-law would she be sleeping in our bedroom with my husband and I, right? Like, or see me with my top off, like throughout the day constantly. But for that season of our life, she was someone who I wanted in that space to close that distance, right? To have that sort of porousness in our relationship so that she could support me in getting restorative rest and sleep while she slept in the room with us, with our child, and had that side had that role in our relationship. Now, when that when that space between us, that boundary is really porous, it can leave a lot of room for connection, right? Or support when we need it. But it doesn't give us a lot of protection, right? So we're maybe connected, but it's not protected. Now, if we have really rigid boundaries, right, then we're really protected, but it's going to be hard to be connected. And so then there are some relationships where that's called for, right? And so there's a lot of different sort of visualizations and ways of kind of looking at boundaries between ourselves and whatever it is that we are exploring a boundary with. And so I hope I didn't lose you in my metaphor, visuals, and description, but that's kind of how I envision it, being a really visual person, and also someone who tends to want to go into my body to like look at what my body's signaling to me, right? In terms of like how does it feel okay to have this sort of closeness or this sort of distance between me and whatever it is that I'm exploring a boundary with.
I love that. It's funny because we talk, like your podcast is called Holding Space. We use that expression a lot about holding space, and boundaries, the way you describe it, is like the space between that allows me to take care of you and to take care of me. And
Yeah.
I love that. I think that's a beautiful place to start. And I am going to draw on someone else's definition too, to help us kind of expand from there and go a step further with it.
Yeah.
So Casey Davis is a therapist and a TikToker, and her conceptualization of a boundary best illustrates my personal and professional relationship with boundaries. She explains it like this.
So as a therapist whose most of my career was around boundary work, I have a slightly different take on boundaries than some other practitioners. For me, a boundary only has to do with my behavior. And this is a really actionable and empowering shift. So saying, don't talk to me that way, is not a boundary. It's a request. Saying or believing, I don't remain in conversations with people that talk to me that way, is a boundary. In this framework, it's actually impossible for you to cross my boundaries because they're always within my control. Boundaries aren't about saying how close you can come because I can't control that. They're about saying how far will I go because that's always within my control. And I always feel empowered, no matter the situation, to have boundaries.
So I'm taking kind of your influence of, it's like the space between that allows me to take care of you and to take care of me, or allows me to care about this thing or this person and care about myself. And then bringing in this almost like this control piece, or I like to visualize it like a circle of here's what I own and here's what you own. And boundaries are 100% in the circle of what I own, because that's what I can control.
Yeah. I think it was my colleague, Dr. Becky, who shared something along the lines of like, when I set a boundary, it's not my job to convince you of anything, right? Like I got to convince myself first that like, this is my boundary. And this is what, like, I've got to convince myself, right? And then it's mine. I own it. And I have agency around that boundary. And then I set it. And how the world around you, right? The people outside that circle you described, how the people around you feel about that, or what they push back on that they get to own that too. Right. And we get to own what we're deciding, right, based on our values, based on our needs, what that boundary is. And it's really not about convincing anybody else. It's just
Yes.
about convincing ourselves. Like, is this something that I need and is important to me and that I feel aligned with? And if I can fall back on that, then when the pushback comes, right? Even if it's with my child, right? Like if the
Mm-hmm.
pushback comes, because that's their job, they get to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then I have that sort of like security, that sort of sturdiness of being able to fall back on, I'm going to hold this boundary, maintain this boundary because it aligns with this thing that's very important to me. And I've convinced myself of that. Does that resonate
Yes.
with you?
Yes, absolutely. And I find the distinction between requests and boundaries to
Mm,
be seismic because what a lot of people call boundaries are actually just requests. So I would love to
mhm,
like dig into this a little bit with you. You can request that your mother doesn't yell at your children
mhm,
using the best nonviolent communication template. But you can't hold a boundary that your mother doesn't yell at your children because that's not within your control. You can
mhm,
hold a boundary that you don't leave your children alone with people who yell at them
mhm.
because that is within your control. So, could you maybe speak to that distinction between a request and a boundary?
Yeah, yeah. I really appreciate the example here that you're kind of giving because yeah, I think when you're requesting something, I think that what kind of comes there is like it's a conversation. And it's not that when you set boundaries, there's not going to be some sort of potential conversation, right? But
Mhm.
a request sort of leaves this space for them to then say, well, this is my opinion and my thoughts around it, right? And
Yeah.
then from there you might choose with that data about what your boundary is going to be, right, based on how they maybe responded to that request. But I sort of see it between saying, please, please don't yell at my kids versus I'm not going to let you yell at my kids, right? Or not even saying anything, but making the choice yourself, but you have agency around, like, I'm not going to let her yell at my kids. And so these are the choices and boundaries that I'm going to set, right? That I've now
Yes.
convinced myself of. Does that kind
Yes. Yes,
of,
absolutely. I think it's really important for us to just be clear in our minds about that distinction between like in this moment, am I like just knowing what is a request and what is a boundary? So in this moment, like here's a request I could make, and here is my boundary, and my boundary is 100% within my control. So just like
Mhm.
that example, like I do hear a lot of people who, I might be working with in coaching who will say, like I hold a boundary that my mom doesn't yell at my children and yet she keeps doing it. So like that's actually a request, not a
Yeah.
boundary. And it
Mhm.
is okay to make requests, but what is your boundary around this? Meaning what is 100% within your control? For example, I don't leave my children alone with people who yell at them. Like that would be a boundary for me. So like if my mother yelled at my children, then I just wouldn't leave them alone with her. So like one question that I will often help people find the answer to is how does this person add to your life? How are they a value add? So if you completely erase all of the like obligatory things you think you should do or patterns you've fallen into, like if this person just didn't exist and then the universe was like, hey, you know what, like they're going to exist again, in what ways like would you want to have connection with them? In what ways are they a value add for you? And like we can build up from there.
And I think it's so important when we start having these conversations around boundaries and we start really getting nitty gritty and looking at the system around you, the community around you, the people in your network, right? Or the people that you may be doing the boundary setting with acknowledge to acknowledge a few things, history, and your own sort of context. I identify as a woman. I was raised a girl, now walk through the world as a woman, and all of the messages that I've gotten around me around like how important it is for me to take care of my relationships and other people's needs, and just how that's contributed to my own people pleasing parts. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but then also, how there are just certain relationships where I or the listener, you so desperately want this person to be this thing for you, right? To like
Mhm.
to have this role in your life, or the hope that like, well, now that they're a grandparent, or now that we're both parents, that like that they're going to show up for me in this way, or that this change is going to happen. And I just hold on so tightly to that hope that sometimes what happens there is it can get in the way of me setting these boundaries and moving through the grief that comes with the fact that this person is not showing up for me in the way that I need. And what it keeps us from is potentially looking out into the wings, right? That the person that's been waiting in the wings, right? That could show up for you in the way that you deserve. But we've been holding on so tightly for this one person to do it because they have this role that we really wish that they could show up for us in these other ways. And so I want to sort of like name the discourses and the
Yeah.
messages that we just absorb like from birth about around boundaries and what we're supposed to do when it comes to relationships. And also, right, the grief that can come with wanting someone to show up for us in a certain way. So we keep doing the request thing, the request dance,
Yep.
and it's so hard to step into our power with the boundary because the potential loss that we feel could come from that. And it keeps us from seeing what we could potentially gain. You know what I mean?
Yes. Oh my gosh, this leads perfectly into acceptance because that grief part is almost always like a central part of the acceptance process. And acceptance is just, it's this other like key component that I find to successful boundaries. And that is accepting that people are exactly who and where they are today. So
Mhm.
I'm not trying to use a boundary as a tool of manipulation or control of others. I am saying, I believe you when you show me who you are. So accepting that reality, here are the boundaries that I need to hold for my or my children's well-being.
Mhm.
And I find that there is so much struggle when we try to use a boundary as a means of changing someone else.
Mm.
Certainly, people can change in response to boundaries, but that is more of an occasional byproduct and not like the criteria for success or failure of a boundary, because that's not within your control, like we talked about. And there
Mm.
is so much parenting struggle in particular that comes from not accepting your child for exactly the fullness of who they are,
Mm.
including like neurodiversities, right? And
Mm.
where they are in their development today. So that acceptance piece is just huge. There's no boundary that can make an apple tree an orange tree
Mm.
or that can make a seedling bear fruit. Those efforts are fruitful.
Mhm.
They're futile. And like you said, like that really comes up a lot where we get stuck in hoping people will be someone that they're actually not. And we have to grieve the person that we needed
Mm.
in order to accept, or the person that we wanted, or the person we imagined, in order to accept the person that's actually in front of us. So,
Mm.
have you ever struggled to accept the reality of a person or a situation to get to an effective boundary?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what do you want to know, Rachel? Like what, I mean, I think, yeah, I have. And so I think that it's so important for us to know that we're not alone in that experience of
Yes.
struggling to accept someone to and I think that a big part of I know because I work with a lot of adults, so a big part of the work sometimes is, you know, being able to tap into let's say this was a parent, right? Or an adult in your life as a child and maybe still present in your life. And for us to be able to tap into that inner child, right? That part of us that is still there, that is, you know, wired to seek the love and care of those around us because it's literally like
Yeah.
life or death. Like,
Yeah.
and so we have to connect with that part of us that wants to be loved for and cared for by this person in our life. And when we can tap into that part of us and like, again, such a visual person, such a parts person, like, the different parts of me. If I can like get down to that part of me's level and just like scoop her up and be like, you're safe, right? You are lovable. You're an adult now, and you have power and you have agency. You're a parent now. Now is your opportunity to step into that power. And you know what? There was never a question of like your worthiness of having your needs met, right? Or it was
Mhm.
never your job to please those around you. Like you're inherently worthy, all the things that like
Yeah.
I so deeply want every human being to be able to believe and know about
Yeah.
themselves, but can be so tricky, and we absorb so much from the world around us when we're young. But now as an adult, being able to tap into that part of myself that sometimes still seeks that approval or pleasing those around me, or finds it really hard to step into my power, to know that I have that agency and power now, and setting this boundary is one of those ways in which I can do it. And I think that another thing that comes up a lot of times is, we're feelings people. We have all sorts of feelings. And my emotions, my feelings can sometimes be little tricksters. So like sometimes my anxiety can pop up, and, you know, or my overwhelm can pop up and whisper in my ear, like, oh, like this is too much. This is too scary. We need to set a boundary with this thing. Right. And so sometimes if my emotion jumps in the driver's seat, I might find myself like setting quote unquote boundaries with people around me, where where actually it's being driven by anxiety versus
Mm.
being value driven, or like
Mhm.
are really my needs being driven. And so, I think it's so important to like be able to tap into some of that too, because I know for me,
Yeah.
for sure, there have been times where anxiety has jumped in the driver's seat, and I've avoided or set felt like I'm setting a boundary here by just avoiding something, avoiding a conversation, avoiding doing the hard, but at my core, I know is the right thing. And it kind of brands itself as boundary setting. But what's really going on is
Avoidance.
but maybe it's being driven by anger. And the thing
Yeah.
is, I freaking love my angry part. Like anger is an emotion that at its core, when it's not showing up as that secondary protector, when underneath is actually maybe some anxiety, fear, sadness, right? When anger shows up in its core, it can give us that energy and that oomph to say no, to set a boundary. It can give us really beautiful data about what's happening around us to say, I'm not okay with this,
Yeah,
right?
it's power.
It's power. But also sometimes, like, I still want to have, speaking of distance, I want to have a little bit of distance between myself and my emotions so I can notice it. Like, ooh, I'm feeling pissed right now. Like, I'm feeling ragey, or
Yes.
I'm feeling this. Like, what I need to pause and ask myself, like, what's the data here? Like, what's going on in the world around me that is bringing this feeling in my body, right? Or these thoughts, or
Yes.
this sensation of wanting to yell or to run or to hide, or to protect, and to slow down enough to ask myself, okay, there's the data. But if I come back and I land in like, well, what is this data pointing towards? What's helpful in here? What's not? What's important to me? And what am I needing right now? Right.
Yeah.
And emotions can really support us in identifying that, but our emotions don't always get it right. Right. In
Yeah.
terms of like what the
Yes.
reaction or response should be. And so being able to kind of create that distance between myself and my emotions too helps me kind of have that. It's mindfulness. Like, let's call it what it is.
Yeah.
Like, it's
Yeah.
basically mindfulness of being able to be aware of what's coming up and what's driving the decisions or the behavior.
Yes, yes. And oftentimes, like those emotions are kind of working against the acceptance piece. Like I have literally said to a client, which felt really almost cruel, but unavoidably necessary. The hope needs to die.
Mm.
Like
Yeah.
the version of a mother that you needed as a child doesn't exist.
Mm.
Like the mother you have was never that person.
Mm.
And so chasing after that idea of what a mother could be is keeping you stuck, right? Like you can't even get to the part of setting effective boundaries until you accept this person for exactly who she is today and not who you needed her to be or who you hope that she someday could become, because that's none of that's within your control.
Rachel, I have this reel that I created, and like it's just like after I created this reel, I was like, I've now accomplished all I need to accomplish in life. Like this reel explains it all. Like and now I'm done. Like I retire. I felt
Legacy secured.
I felt so good about it. So basically what I did is I took different clips from Frozen, Frozen 2, and kind of like played out this sort of like, in the beginning, it's like, this will all make sense when I am older, while your parents are like screaming at each other. And then, or, screaming at you. And then it kind of moves through this sort of experience of getting older and starting to notice these cycles. And then, the grief that comes with like starting to set boundaries, but holding the boundaries. And then this moment where, I realize like I'm the one that I've been waiting for all my life, just like they sing, just like in Frozen.
Yep.
And there's a scene with my daughter where it's sort of like, I know what I have to do. This is the next right thing, because this matters. And I need to break this cycle, right? And hold these boundaries for these reasons. And I'll share the reel with you. And
Yes, we'll
when
have
this
to link it.
goes live, you can link it. Cause I think that's where my career starts and ends. Cause it's like, that describes
Yeah.
it. Like, that's it, is like, we're here to, we're breaking these cycles and we're doing this work. And it matters because you matter, right? Like even outside of your role as a parent, like you are so deserving and worthy of having the peace and your needs met and worthy of love and care. And I know because most people come to me initially because they're like, I just don't want to screw up my kids. So like their kids are their inspiration to
Yeah.
do the work and like start setting boundaries and create this change. And so for those reasons, right, for stopping cycles and supporting our children, but also for ourselves, like this work is hard and like everything, like what
Yes.
is more important,
Yes.
I don't
This is
know.
how
I
we
think,
change the world. Like we
oh,
break those cycles. And all of this stuff that we're talking about, like in my example about the relationship with like a grown woman and her mother, like I see it playing out even more with parents and their children, like that grief piece. Again, going back to what you said earlier, like we have to grieve the child we imagine so that we are free to accept and love the child that we actually have. And in those like moment to moment parent child interactions, we can't get to boundaries if we're stuck in hope that there'll be someone different than they are. Like if I could just parent the right way, if I could say the right thing, then they would be a different person. They would be the child I imagined. And related side note, that is almost always a projection of your own inner child. Like you want them to be more like you so that you can go back and like reparent yourself through them.
oh my
But you
gosh.
don't need to do that through your kid. You can just do that by how you treat yourself. And part of that is boundaries.
Oh my gosh, it's so so true. As your little side note here, just like, oh yeah, like I'm just thinking about the things that the trip ups I've had where I've just been like, oh my gosh, like as the words are coming out of my mouth, I'm like, what are you doing here? And it almost always is like, get back in this little box. I need you to get back in this box because
Yes.
then I know what to do. Like,
Mhm.
or then you know, then I won't be so I won't have to carry this shame anymore. And it's like,
Yeah.
oof, that's not where putting my kid in that box isn't where that work's got to happen. Mm-mm.
Yes, yes, yes. We have to just accept people for who they are, for who they show us that they are, so that we can then move into that boundary setting space of accepting who you are, what is within my control that's related to how I show up in this situation that takes care of my well-being. And I'll share a personal example. So my father is easily overwhelmed. I could have spent years wasting energy trying to make requests that he was not willing or able to meet. And uh, or I could accept that he was easily overwhelmed and set a boundary for our well-being, which for us looked
Mhm.
like we never left him alone with more than one kid at a time.
Mhm.
Like sometimes it really is that simple. Like I
Mm.
could spend a lifetime fighting against his way of being and nothing would have come from it. Like I can, even
Mhm.
with all of the best like therapy, jujitsu, right? Like I can't change someone who doesn't want to change, or,
Mhm. Yep.
whether it's like willing or able is kind of a moot point because you don't own that. Like that's not within your hula hoop, right?
Yep.
So like accepting he is who he is, what do I need to do differently to take care of my family's well-being? And it was so simple. Like we just never left him with more than one kid at a time. And then it was great. It was wonderful. It was fine.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And sometimes it does seem so much, it doesn't seem that simple because we're just so in that whirlwind of our feelings about it, And
Yes. Yes.
so even taking that moment to pause and creating that space. Okay, what was the trigger? Um, and what does my response want to be? Or what are the feelings that I'm having? What's the data there? All right, like sadness, all right, grief, all right, fear, all right, anger. Like, what are you letting me know?
Yeah.
And then coming back to like that space, that mindfulness can sometimes help really give us the opportunity to see what do we actually need here? Like
Yes.
what could support this situation? What could be the boundary that I can set? It's in my agency that can help me move through this.
Yeah. And we often have to revisit it, like spending time with your father, with your children.
Mhm.
Like your father is amazing with your children. And so every time I was like in that space with your father and your children, I would be aware, I would notice that feeling rising up in me. And like having to remind myself to like, let's circle back to like accepting the people in
Mhm.
your life for exactly who and where they are.
Mhm.
And, having those boundaries to help ensure everyone's well being. So it's normal if you have to like keep revisiting that too.
100%. I think one of the like hardest truths that I think we all like got to land on at some point and then again keep reminding ourselves of is that like there is not like this destination, right? It's like
Yeah.
we're constantly like when you think about the words like balance and like all like boundaries, like we're constantly having to come back and tweak and adjust. And I think that it's once we accept that, come back to acceptance, I think
Yeah.
then it frees us up, right? To
100%.
to keep checking in with ourselves and to have that kind of relationship with ourselves and our lives and our relationships where we allow ourselves to see like, well, what's coming up for me now? Where have things shifted? Like where do I want to where do I want to shift things now? It's just
Yeah.
it's not a
And to
destination.
enjoy those relationships so
Right.
much more and to connect with all the value of each of these relationships. Like if I'm stuck on who this person isn't, I'm not falling in love with who this person is.
Mm, yeah. Ugh.
Okay. How do you know when to hold a boundary or how do you decide a boundary is warranted?
So I my body will give me clues and clue me in or give me the flags. If I'm not looking for it, like it's so easy for
Mhm.
us to like not be embodied, right? Like in our
Mhm.
body. But like if I am on the phone with someone and it's someone who's like, oh, I really want to talk to the kids, right? It's been so long I haven't talked to you. And I get on the phone with them and maybe I'm good for like 5-10 minutes. And then I just start to feel it in my bones. Like, well, for me, it different relationships and different flags show up in different parts of my body, right? So like it might be in my throat, it might be in my stomach, it might be in my head. I start to kind of lose my sense of self, right? And I think that kind of speaks to it too, right? Like because
Yes.
if this boundary, like if you use the word that you use this like circle idea earlier, like if I'm in the circle and the boundaries around me and they're on the other side of the circle, if that circle around me is really porous, I'm going to start to lose my sense of self too, right? Like
Yes.
what's important to me, what my needs are. I start to lose that sense of self and my body sends me those vibes.
Oh my
like
God. Yes. I have to like lose the version of me that feels authentic in order to feel safe in this connection with this person in this current form.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, and the same thing can go for like things. So like, or other objects, right? So like
Yeah.
Instagram. If I'm scrolling Instagram and I start to just get those like feelings in my body, and or start to feel like I lose a little bit of sense of myself. That's a signal to me. If I'm watching the news and I am starting to lose sense of self and security, and my body is sending me signals that I'm starting to really spiral into fear or rage or whatever. I mean, all of that is still, it's data. It's not bad. It's just data that like,
Yeah.
maybe there's something here, a boundary that I need to set, because I'm starting to lose my sense of self and like what my values are, what's important to me, what I'm needing. This is not like feeling replenishing. This is like draining,
Yeah.
So, and I think that there is a lot of privilege in being able to set boundaries. For instance, if I'm watching something on the news and it's just overwhelming to me or it's devastating and it's not something that I have to live and breathe every day, I have the privilege to set a boundary, right? And turn off the news. And I think one way in which we can use our privilege for change is by actually giving ourselves permission to have boundaries so we can replenish, so we can have the energy to come back and use maybe the anger we were feeling about the situation to oomph us into,
Yeah.
taking steps that we do have agency around to create change, right? And be an agent of change, to be an advocate, or an activist or an ally. And so I think that there's also ways in which boundaries are really important in, activism, in advocacy, in things that are happening outside of us too.
Yeah. That you can't pour from an empty cup.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh man, you covered so much important ground. Thank you for bringing all of those points. And I'm gonna take it to like a super practical kind of parenting-y kind of place now because you
Yeah.
covered all the like big existential components. So thank you.
Yeah. Here for that. And now please bring it home, Rachel. Make it tangible for me.
Now the Sesame Street portion of this question.
Yeah.
Okay, so in our family, we have 3 agreements, like respect yourself, respect others, respect the environment. And if you are out of alignment with one of those agreements, I will hold a boundary to ensure safety from harm. So as long as you are in alignment with that, freedom is our default. And I would say that 80% of boundaries that mainstream parents hold are completely unnecessary. And I advocate for letting go of the 80% of boundaries that actually don't matter and then going all in with like calm, confident, compassionate consistency on the 20% that you as a family deem essential. And this really breeds trust. Like my children trust that if I am holding a boundary, there is a really good reason for it. And if there is a boundary, I am going to hold it. So the short answer for me would be like, do no harm, essentially. Like when do I need to hold a boundary? How do I decide a boundary is warranted? Like do no harm is essentially what it boils down to. For example, we were going out to a nice dinner and West walked out wearing pajama pants. Does that violate any of our 3 agreements? No, it does not. There is no risk of harm in that choice. So I did make a request. This is a pretty nice restaurant, buddy. Would you be willing to put on sweatpants instead of pajama pants? But I didn't hold a boundary that I won't take people to restaurants who are wearing pajama pants because no actual harm, right? So that is a big part of how I decide, like, is a boundary warranted or not? Is there a potential for harm? Like, is there a serious potential for harm here? I even sometimes take it far enough to ask myself, like, is there a threat of serious harm that we can't come back from still like whole? In terms of like, do I stop them from climbing that tree? Do I, you know what I mean? Like really trying to get to the nitty gritty. Like, is the risk of harm serious harm, life-threatening harm, that kind of thing, like to self or others or environment? Is it something that any of those pieces can't come back from? And certainly, like you mentioned, privilege, there is certainly a privilege piece in this. There's privilege in terms of who we can hold boundaries with, when we can hold boundaries, what boundaries we feel need to be in place. But I think the metric can be universal of like, is there a threat of serious harm? And if there is, like, no matter where that line is for you, based on the privileges you do or do not have, that is how I decide that a boundary is warranted.
Oof, it's making me think about screen time and like some of the, like, just, I'm like, no, so we need screen time limits. We need screen time limits. And my kids, my son is so confused because I'm freaking confused. Like he is so confused. And it just leads to so many like disconnecting exchanges between the two of us. It also makes me think about food and like my big thing with my kids is like listen to and trust your body, you know. And yet when my daughter right now loves Takis, these Takis chips, and like Takis are pretty good. Like I don't mind a few Takis, but like I like she will sit in a room and just like she'll just like eat and eat these Takis while she's like, you know, playing Minecraft or something. And it's like there's this thing inside me that's like wants to tell her like, no, you can't keep eating all these Takis. Like you need to eat something healthy, which is like so not like my parent, like not the kind of parent I want to be, and what that doesn't feel right, like that's what was said to me, you know, and like and but it's just like this urge to like to control situation. But the question of does it cause harm and like serious bodily harm, right? Like, and is this a battle or like a boundary that aligns? Yeah, it's making me think of screen time, making me think of food. It's also making me think of dress, like what they wear.
No, I love that all this is coming up. This gives us such like juicy examples to work through. Like, so for example, a boundary that I hold for myself is that I don't comment on what they're eating in the moments. And so for example, if I'm trying to think of how best to say this. So in the moments, my boundary for myself is that I notice and I wonder out loud. So I will notice and wonder things out loud in the moment, but I don't actually set any boundaries in the moment around things that are not risk of serious harm. Once each season, or if your kids are younger, you could do it like once each month as part of our the bucket system course, the program that I have. Once each season, we come together for a collaboration session. And that is where like once each season I get to bring up any like things I've noticed, concerns I might have. I noticed like when you are playing Minecraft and snacking, you are eating a lot more. And then you say your tummy hurts kind of for the rest of the evening. So like, and then it's really, short of serious harm, I don't go to boundaries, I go to collaboration. And it's collaboration with my children where I share the things that I've noticed, the things that, or even new things that I've learned, right? Like, oh, this study just came out and it showed this. And so I was, I've kind of been like observing, and have you felt that? Have you noticed that? And then we will come up with an agreement together about how to best support this person with this thing. And then we will say, okay, so let's observe for the next season. Let's try it this way. Let's just try it and see what we learn. And then we'll come back together in our next collaboration session and make adjustments. And those, like in that system, there are a lot of boundaries for me to not be hyper controlling and to not be quick to judgment, and to give my kids like a valid seat at the table, because really my ultimate goal is to help them learn about themselves and how to help themselves navigate the world, right? Not for me to just set all the boundaries for them and they never learn that. So having the boundary, and I find this helps a lot of other parents too, where you like only make these like rules or these boundaries or draw these hard conclusions once each season, and you can only change them once each season, is incredibly freeing.
Oh my gosh, totally. I mean, I think that I know my son and I are both so fatigued from the screen time conversations, right? And
Yes.
like the kid, I mean, like I freaking love kids. Like the other day he said, he's like, Mom, can we change this rule? And then this be like the last time we change it. And I'm like, as I'm just like, oh my gosh, like I'm so not sturdy around this boundary because I just have, it's a tricky one for me and for us. And
Yeah.
because and I think it's what happens so often too is like my daughter, she does screen time and then I see her take breaks and like she goes
Mhm.
outside and like she yeah and he doesn't and he's younger, but like he
Mhm.
will just like get locked in and it's just like we'll forget to eat, use the bathroom, like all these things. And so there's like their comparison kind of trickles in, fear, anxiety, like my own stuff around screen time, like, and then realizing like as I'm telling him like limits around screen time, I'm on my phone all the time. And it's like, it's just like this is shame, all that lovely gunk just like flowing in. And the poor kids just like, can we just like make a decision here? You know? Oh, yeah.
Yes. Oh my gosh, yes. I find like having like a set amount of time, like if they're younger or it's something that's really the results of it are really intense, like you can shorten it from a season to like a month or something. Like if, for
Mhm.
example, if like you're trying a new medication for something, right? Like a season might be too
Mhm.
long. But still that idea of having a boundary for yourself of how often you are going to allow yourself to revisit this decision. Otherwise, it's like total decision fatigue. Like you're trying to evaluate it constantly.
Yeah.
Instead, like just say we're going to evaluate it once a season or however often. And between now and then, we're just going to note all of the things that we notice and all
Mm.
of the things that we learn about ourselves and about you and about our home or about your body or your mind or whatever the thing is that you're working on, right?
Mhm.
Like we're just the only job for our brains for this next month or this next season is just to notice and just observe and to see what we learn. Like I'm going to read this other book about it. Maybe that'll give me some new ideas, by having that boundary that we don't revisit it. We don't come back together and actually make changes in collaboration outside of that boundary is,
Mm.
I found it to be incredibly helpful. And for the record, in terms of eating while gaming, just for people out there listening in our family, we don't eat and game. And part of how that works out is just the spaces where they game. Like
Mm.
there's no food in those spaces.
Mhm. Yeah.
We kind of set that up. We came to that through collaboration because it was like always messy. Like people would like leave food there. It would be a mess. And
Mm.
like it, and then they kept eating more of the food than really was like their share. And then their siblings would be upset that it was gone. And so we sort of
Mhm.
came to the idea of, okay, let's try, like, there's just no food in this space. So if you
Yeah.
want to eat, you like pause the game and you go into the other space. And that like has been the way, like for years, it's worked
Mm.
beautifully for us.
Yeah, I like that. I love that. I love all of it. It's so freeing to think about, to just like sit with the decision and to then just observe and take note and then come
Yeah.
back. Cause oof, the decision fatigue and just the like what ends up feeling like micromanaging fatigue,
Yes.
like
Yeah.
and yeah, like I don't want to be the micromanager of my child's life. Like that's not going to
Yeah.
serve me, them, our relationship. So
Yeah. And sometimes like remind yourself that none of this, like this is not an emergency.
yeah.
Like this, like I said, like if it's not life or death or like threat of like serious bodily harm that you can't come back from, then you can give it that time.
Mm, yeah. I love it.
Okay. Why is it important to not let fear of intense feelings showing up prevent us from holding essential values aligned boundaries?
Oof. Okay, the question. Let me unpack it. So fear of intense feelings. Like why okay, share the question again. I want to sit with
Why
it.
is it important to not let fear of intense feelings showing up prevent us from holding essential values aligned boundaries?
And are these intense feelings our own or others
I
intense?
love that question. Either.
Yeah, because I was going to say like
Both.
both are going to show up, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so yeah, and I think this kind of comes back to some of the other pieces that we've talked about here. So like when we're holding a boundary, like we don't, again, it's not about convincing anyone else, and they get to have their feelings about it, right? Whether it's our child having big feelings about it or our parents having or a family member having a big feeling about it, like they get to have those big feelings. And if we've set the boundary from a space of this is aligned with my values, my needs, I can fall back on that. I only need to convince myself here, and I've convinced myself, then then the boundary we have between us and them is that they get to keep having their they get to have their feelings about it. I mean, a child's job is to have big feelings, right? And
Yeah.
like for and to express those things and to learn their feelings, right? About these things. They get to. And I know so many times I've gotten caught up in like, I just want my child to be happy,
Mm.
and like, but then what that leads to is just maneuvering things and like making the boundaries loose in a way that actually doesn't create security, right? Because it's like,
Yeah.
wait, who's in charge? Who's who's keeping us safe here, right?
Yeah.
And so our child gets to have those big feelings. Other people, they get to have those big feelings, and that is not something that should be the gauge of whether or not our boundary was the right boundary, right? The gauge
Yeah.
is like when I look back inside, is this aligned with my values? If I convinced myself, is this something that I believe in? Well, okay, I've convinced myself, and how others react doesn't need to shift and change, right? Like
Yeah.
have empathy, right? But I actually think that I can have more space for empathy when I have held my boundary, right?
Yes.
It's easier to communicate my empathy when I'm holding my boundary and I'm not losing myself in that exchange. Um,
Yes.
and I don't want to be afraid of my own feelings, kind of speaking to what we talked about earlier. Like I like whether it's guilt or fear, or anxiety or anger, like we said earlier, like those feelings, we're wired for them. They're there to give us lots of data about the world around us, but they don't always get it right. And if they jump in the driver's seat, sometimes they can rebrand boundaries in a way that's more motion driven than value driven. And
Mm-hmm.
so we're going to have feelings, right? You're going to, like, if guilt pops up, I love guilt. Guilt's one of my favorite parts of myself because it pops up and it's like, oh, but like this is things really important to you. And then
Yes.
I can be like, yeah, you're right. That is something that's important to me. But because you're the emotion and I am me self, like I have the whole picture of like this thing is important to me, but maybe this is what I'm choosing to prioritize. Or the way that I'm going to actually define and align with this thing that you're saying is important to me is by actually holding this boundary, right? And
Yes.
so there's so many different ways in which that can look more tangibly. I know I love that you take my big ideas and make them more tangible. So feel free to do that. But
Yes.
I think that, if we can relate to our emotions in a way that has a little bit of space where we feel them, but they don't overwhelm or jump in the driver's seat and drive the behavior.
Yes. Like my kids trust that I've got them. I will
Yeah.
keep them safe from hurting themselves, from hurting people they care about, or from hurting their environment. There is rest for them in that trust. Like
Mm,
their nervous system doesn't have to be vigilantly engaged in that extra layer of alertness that comes with fear of feelings, like anxiety about anxiety, right?
yeah.
There's this huge secondary benefit that my children receive in the way I show up with boundaries. My peaceful confidence communicates to them that I am not afraid of their big feelings and
Yeah.
they need not be either. And that is profound. I mean, Cassidy, in your work as a therapist, how often are adults tripping over their unhealthy coping strategies for avoiding feelings?
Oh my goodness. I mean, it shows up in so many ways.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like my daughter's been going through some stuff with friends, and while she's navigating that at the adult level, like there's so many different things that are happening where it's just like, oh my gosh, like we're adults and we're still trying to figure this stuff out, you know?
Yeah.
Mm,
And for me too, it feels disrespectful to not let people own their feelings.
mm,
Like that feels disrespectful for me. Like there's a lot of like childism in that when we're talking about the parent-child relationship, but I definitely see it like almost filter up too into my interactions with other adults, that it would be like if I set a boundary and someone had feelings about that and I quickly tried to like quash those feelings, like that would be so disrespectful, right? Like, and invalidating. And it's the same with kids. Like, you need to respect them enough to let them own their feelings and to give them the space to have feelings about this stuff. And definitely a boundary that I have to work at holding for my own like little Enneagram 2 like helper heart is that I have boundaries for myself about not taking care, not overextending, not crossing that space that a boundary creates, like you talked about, in order to take care of other people in their feelings about the boundaries that I put in place.
Yes. As a 2 over here too, yes, I can very much relate.
Okay, what advice do you have about having those hard boundary setting conversations? How can we best set a boundary?
Yeah. So, you could just say no.
What?
Love that one. But yeah, so I think that, before we kind of get into the conversation, we have to kind of do the work of like, you know, convincing ourselves, right? Of like, what is the boundary? What are my values that are driving this boundary? Really just kind of doing the work of like connecting in with that. I think the feelings that come up, the grief, like holding space for those feelings, right? Like what's the data that these feelings are offering me? But then coming back to like what it is that we need. And I think that's a really tricky thing, is a lot of times it's like, wait, I don't actually know what it is that I need.
Yeah.
And so we do need to spend a little bit of time before we can communicate, right, what we need. Because gosh, as much as I wish your partner or that person can read your mind and figure out your needs, they cannot. And so we got to be direct about those things, and we got to know what it is for ourselves, And so, I think sitting with that and figuring those pieces out. And I think that our body can oftentimes signal to us some of these pieces. So like maybe this is a person who I am okay having, a phone call with. But if certain topics come up, because my body tells me that I start to lose myself when those topics come up, like that's a boundary for me. Or I will talk with this person, but only for this amount of time, And so kind of figuring out what those needs are. And then, I think being clear and expressing what it is that you need. So, you know, this is what I need this, or I love I promised myself blank, right? Or I'm not comfortable with blank. That doesn't work for me,
Yeah.
And then, sometimes, we just don't quite know yet. And so being able to say something like, I need to think about this. So just kind of, that I think that kind of starts the conversation, right?
Yeah.
And then, I think and then when we need to be more firm, being able to sort of say, you can express empathy, right? Like I hear that, this is upsetting to you, or that you're feeling disappointed. I know that maybe you wanted me to say something else, or you weren't expecting this. And I get that. I really do, and I'm sticking to what I said, like
Yeah.
this is my boundary. My answer is still blank. Or I know you don't agree with this, but I need you to respect it. Um,
Yes.
and yeah, so, I think we got to do the work within ourselves, get to know our needs, feel secure in our boundary, convince ourselves, communicate, what the need is. We can have empathy while still then being firm about what our boundary is going to be.
Yeah, that you don't have to agree, but you do have to respect it. Like there's sort of this like script that I will often give people about like when it comes to other people who care about you, like well-intentioned family communicating their concerns over and over and over and over and over and over
Mhm.
like that. On this issue, we have heard we have heard all of the concerns that you've brought to us. And we've done our own research and really gotten to know the needs of this specific unique child very well. And this is the decision that we've made on this issue. So you don't have to agree with it, but you do have to respect it. And what that would look like is not expressing those concerns to us anymore.
Yeah.
Like whatever it is. I think the magic ingredients that I have found for holding boundaries are calmly, clearly, firmly, briefly. Like I wish there was some cute acronym I could come up with for that, but I got nothing. Just calmly, clearly, firmly, briefly. Those are like the 4 ingredients. Because if we're reactive, like if we're not calm, then it becomes about the relationship and not about the thing.
Yeah.
Like then it's about like what kind of a person I am, or this dynamic between the two of us, or she doesn't love me, or, whatever, as opposed to just being about the Takis or the whatever it is. Right. And we're often talking to the amygdala or the caveman lizard survival instincts parts of the brain and not the prefrontal cortex where all the rational judgment takes place. So we have to keep it really simple and clear. Because when you show up with a boundary, people will often they'll like flip into that other part of their brain. So recognizing like simple and clear, like this is not the conversation to dive into all that research you mentioned doing. Like you can say like, oh, I can email you some of my favorite resources if you would like to learn more about it. But like, you don't try and go into that here in this conversation. Same with kids, right? Like you don't need to launch into like a rant against all of the ingredients on the back of the Takis package. Like just simple and clear. And then people can tell by the way I communicate a boundary that it is firm, right? Like that firm piece. And the boundary setting part is brief, like keep it brief. We don't need to talk it to death. If you're anything like me, you're a talker and you just want to talk about feelings and talk about all the sides of the issue and collaborate until the cows come home. But that usually just re-triggers the people over and over and over and over. And I see it like in coaching, I'll often have parents send me videos of their kids having a hard moment. When the parent just like talks about it and then talks about it, like states the boundary and then states it again and then states it again. It's like every time they do that, the kid's like upset starts all over. It's like they have to move through the feelings all over again. So just keep the boundary setting portion short. Like one sentence is enough, like just one sentence, and that's good.
Yeah.
And I'll say not all boundaries need to be verbally established too. Like in my earlier example about my dad, like I just never left my dad with more than one kid. I didn't have a big conversation with him about it. It wouldn't have helped or been advantageous in any way. Sometimes those conversations are a value add and can deepen intimacy and like provide an opportunity for growth, but not always.
Totally. Yep. No, absolutely. It's you're knowing that you're setting the boundary for yourself, and that's enough.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, you have all listening heard me invite you to find the yes. So keep that in mind with boundaries. If you're saying this path is a no, then offer them a path that's a yes whenever possible. So if punching the other kid in the face is not the path to getting their toy back, then what is? If forcing a hug is not the path for your mother-in-law to connect with her grandchild, then what is? It is so much easier to replace something than to stop it. So Cassidy, when do you think it's helpful to offer a redirect with a boundary?
Yeah. So, okay. I think, with the example that you gave, I think it's so helpful in putting ourselves like in giving a generous interpretation of like, okay, so let's say my mother-in-law or the child's grandmother or great grandmother is like, give me a hug, and like kind of forcing that, and not comfortable with that. And our child's not comfortable with that. Right. So it's easy for me to get frustrated maybe in that situation where it's like, oh gosh, I've told you before, like we don't force hugs, but if I come back to, okay, in this moment, I think in a moment where I can give that generous interpretation, like I think this person just, they want a way to connect. And like, that's how they feel love. That's what they're hoping for. They want to feel connected to my child. Okay. And I think in a moment like that, when I can access that kind of like more generous interpretation, I think a redirect is really valuable, right? So like, okay, let's think of another way that the two of you can connect in this moment, right? Like, and maybe if I, going into it also could predict that the situation could happen, like if I can redirect like a pre-redirect, right? So it's like maybe I chat with my child, hey, Nana might want to give you a hug. How are you feeling about that today? Yeah. Okay. So when Nana comes in and is trying to give you a hug, like what is something that you would feel comfortable with, right?
Yeah.
And then so like a pre kind of conversation or kind of landing on for myself or if I'm supporting my child with them, and then in a situation where like I can access that generous interpretation, I think that kind of gives me a little bit more empathy and data to kind of support what that redirect might look like. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Like assuming the best of intentions. And I think the only other piece that I would add is about like identifying the need that they're trying to meet through this behavior that I'm saying is no longer in alignment with my boundaries. Like, so and I do that. I try to be very clear in my mind. Like I'm not doing that to own or to like prevent them having feelings about it. I'm just doing it to try and like make things more efficient in this relationship that I care about. Or to, if I'm telling my kid that's not the way to meet that need, then I have to I have to teach them or show them another way to get that need met. Otherwise their brains are just going to keep going to that wall and then hitting it, right? Because they don't know any different. They don't know any better. Um, so I definitely just try and keep them in, like you said, like assuming the best of intentions, like removing a lot of the judgment from it. Like if, my example, one kid punches another kid in the face because they took their toy and they want to get it back. Like it doesn't mean that kid is evil. It just means like they wanted their toy and that was the only idea that they had. Right. So like if we can replace it with something else, then it gives their brain this other way that in their body, this other way that they can go. And then you just kind of help them practice it a few times. And really, it's the same with adults. Like if we can identify what the need is, then we can be efficient in offering them another way to meet that need. And that tends to like take care of the problem very efficiently.
Yeah, and I think this idea of like a pre-redirect, there's got to be another word for it, but like, with the situation with like your child, punching another kid because they wanted the toy, if I'm going to, if I'm driving to a play date or a situation that I think might be tricky for my child, and having a conversation about it, like, hey, we're going here, and like, there might be this situation, like, like just being curious of like, what do you think about that? Like I
Yes.
think that there's so many opportunities to have these conversations before we get there. And before we're in the situation, and that's not always going to happen, right? But as we get to know our kids more intimately, and we anticipate these things, my colleague Dr. Becky Kennedy calls it like I think she calls it like a vaccination, like a
Mm.
pre-vaccination, right? Is that what she calls it? Where it's basically like you're kind of you're kind of having the conversation and doing this work, preparing them, right? So
Yes.
that when the feeling comes up or the situation comes up, they can kind of land back on this conversation that you guys have had,
Yes. I
Yeah.
completely agree with this. It circles back to the acceptance piece of like accepting who your kid is and where they are right now, and accepting that in other people as well. Like there was like a solid year with one of my kids where I could not be outside of arm's reach from the kid, and
Mhm.
going into these social. I mean, my kid wasn't punching kids in the face, but
Mhm.
it was just very, very physical. Like he would run up to a friend and to greet them, like shove them really hard, like just so excited to see them, right? When
Mhm.
he was like really, really, really little. And there was literally a solid year where I couldn't be outside of arm's reach. And we would practice, like before we would go to the park to meet up with everyone, like we would role play and we would use little guys, and like they would walk up to each other and what would they do to greet each other? And I would give him
Mhm.
other things that he could do, like to say hi. Like he would put up his hand for a big high five and he would say high five. And if they put up their hand, he could give a big slap, right? So he could still have that like gross motor connection,
Mhm.
but it would be in a more appropriate way.
Yeah. Yep. Love it.
Okay. Being on the receiving end of a boundary can be hard. How can we
Mm.
receive boundaries in a healthy way?
Yeah. I mean, I think again, it's like when we talk about emotions, right? My emotions are going to give me all sorts of data, and like my body's
Mhm.
going to give me data. And so if I'm on the receiving end of a boundary, whew, like I'm listening to my body and I'm listening to my emotions. I'm not necessarily letting them jump in the driver's seat or doing my best. So I'm being mindful of of those pieces, right? But I'm attuning to it. I'm like, okay, so there's a part of me that feels really angry. There's a part of me that's super pissed off that like this person is setting this boundary, or I'm so hurt, or I feel so like there's like that victim part of me, right? Um, or the overwhelmed part of me, or the shame, or the guilty shame part of me, right? That like I did something wrong. If I do this parts work, like mindfulness around parts work of like, okay, there's that part of me, and I'm listening to that part of me, the data it's offering me about the situation, it gives me enough space to see, okay, in this, like in the data my feelings are offering me, like how is there anything here that's helpful, right? And can I pull from that, to because emotions can a lot of times give us a sense of our values too.
Yeah.
And then coming back and landing on my values, now I can choose how I'm going to respond. Because again, remember, when you were the person setting the boundary, that the person receiving it, they have agency control over all their stuff too. Like they get to own that. Like you don't get to control that either. So
Yeah.
just being on the receiving end, I still get the pleasure of having my own decision of how I'm going to choose to respond, right? And
Yes.
what I want is for that response to be intentional, not reactive, right? And so when
Yeah.
it's more reactive, that's like I got triggered and I just reacted quickly with the emotion jumping in the driver's seat. But when it's intentional, I'm mindful of like, oh, okay, this is coming in. My emotions are giving me this data, and I really value this. So I'm going to choose to respond in this way. And I think that just, that sort of space that we give ourselves and agency, can really support the exchange, the relationship, to allow you to feel good and in alignment with how you hold space for the boundary that was just communicated with you.
Yes. Oh, that was so helpful. I think like I give myself permission and will have even like practiced to get to this point that when I feel all of those parts of myself like standing up, then I give myself permission to receive everything that the person is offering in this sort of middle space between us, and to respond by saying, I'm going to think about all that, or I'm going to think on everything you just offered me, or I'm basically just giving myself permission to say, I'm going to think on all that and get back to you.
Mm-hmm.
And I have done that in really hard moments, and I always am so grateful that I did. Or if it's something that a boundary someone's trying to offer me for my own kid, like something big or important, not something momentarily, right? Like they're about to stick their fork in a light socket, not something like that, obviously, but something, that I can give more thought to. I will respond by saying, I'm going to check in with my child about that and I'll get back to you. So like, I'm not receiving it. I'm not taking it into my circle, into my bubble, into my hula hoop, right? But I'm also not rejecting it.
Mm-hmm.
If so many parts are standing up and they're so loud that I can't really evaluate what's being offered to me clearly, and or I need some time to sort through all of it, like if it's a lot, I will say something like, I'm going to take some time to sit with all of that and I'll get back to you. And I find that to be it has served me tremendously well.
I think it's such a beautiful offering to yourself, right? It's
Yeah.
space, right? Like
Yeah.
we
While
we talk
still
about
being
holding.
respectful to the other person, because what they have to say might be totally like valid and important growth for me or whatever, right? Like it might be something that I come circle back and say, like, I really took that in and like I learned X, Y, and Z from it. And I, I think the boundary you're bringing up is a fantastic idea. And I think it'll help everyone involved. Like it certainly can come back that way, or it can come back the other way, right? That like, so here's the boundary that I'm going to set for myself, like based on what you're offering me, and that's okay too. So it's not about necessarily where you end up, it's more like how can you navigate those boundaries setting interactions and conversations in a way that's respectful of everyone's ownership of their parts.
Yep. Yep.
And when it comes to my children receiving boundaries from others, I am often in the role of translator, like orienting my kids, like perhaps you would a foreign exchange student, to the norms and expectations of our society, just to get like a practical piece in about like helping your kids with this. For example, if my kid is wearing nothing but swim trunks and wants to go in the shave ice shop, I will pause with him get down on his level, point out the no shoes, no shirt, no service sign, and read it aloud for him. And then I might then say, this store has a boundary that they only let people in who are wearing a shirt and shoes. Would you like to put on your shirt and shoes to go inside and get shave ice? And then I'll honestly let him decide. So I'm bringing those spheres of control into my children's awareness, right? Like they get to make the rules for their store. You get to decide if you want to patron their store or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love it.
Okay, let's move into our deep dive. The show notes can be found at sagefamily.com/podcast77, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. What, Cassidy, are your favorite resources for people to dive deeper into this topic or to connect more deeply with you?
Yeah, so you can find me having lots of conversations around this stuff and how it shows up in so many different ways, right? Whether it's with your partner or with your providers, right? Or with people around you or with your children and your relationship with your children, on my podcast, Holding Space. And if you are a therapist or a coach tuning in, talk a lot about boundaries and perfectionism and all this stuff, and how, money mindset, all this stuff on my other podcast, Holding Space for Therapists. And you can find me on Instagram too, where I'm chatting about these things. I will share the link to that one reel with Rachel, so we can share that in the show notes too. So I'm at Dr. Cassidy on Instagram. And I've talked about boundaries on other podcasts beyond my own too. There was a podcast episode about boundaries for people pleasers, where I share a little bit more just about my own personal story of growing up and how I kind of became a people pleaser and how I've kind of unhooked myself from that. So if you're looking for a more personal kind of like background story, that's on the Shrink Chicks podcast. And yeah, so there's a couple different places where you can learn more about boundaries. I have a course with an OBGYN called Prepared Postpartum, and there's a whole section in there about putting in place really important boundaries for yourself before your baby is born. So that you can activate your support system, but also have expectations and boundaries and in place and communication sort of strategies to be able to do that, right? With different people in your life. And that's our course, Prepared Postpartum. So those are a couple different places where you can kind of do more deep dive work if you're interested in doing that with me.
Wonderful. I'm going to find the links to all of that stuff. I'll also link to the other episodes you've been on with this podcast, talking about therapy and social media. And I wish I could recommend some like solid books or something that I've read on boundaries, but honestly, like a lot of the boundaries content out there, I feel like it kind of misses the mark, or like it's not, it kind of confuses requests and boundaries.
Yeah.
I feel like that doesn't work very well. So I feel a bit like selfish being like, I'm going to send you to all of Cassidy's things and just listen to this conversation and nothing else.
This is all you need. No, but like, yeah, I mean, I think like in the deeper dive stuff, I think, there's so much nuance to all of our stories. And so reaching out to get support, to have conversations with people around your experiences in your story, that might be with a therapist, or that might be with somebody in your life, or that might be with another provider, or another person that you just feel really connected with, that can support you in unpacking your story, right? And so I think that the deep dive can happen in those contexts too.
Yes, for the deep dive, go to Cassidy for Therapy if you live in California, or come do coaching with me.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect.
Cassidy, thank you so much for being my first and only third timer.
I am so deeply honored to be a third timer and to be your first. Thanks, Rachel.
And
for having me on.
I look forward to any future conversations about rocks or anything else. You are welcome here anytime. But special gratitude for this conversation because it's like a hugely important one. I feel like it is just desperately needed right now, and I hope that people got a lot of value from it.
Thank you so much. I always learn from you and always appreciate our conversations, no matter the topic. You are just such a special person in my life. And I'm so grateful to be back on and just to have spent the past hour and a half with you, Rachel. I'm so grateful.
I love you, friend.
Love you too.